Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online program titled Troublemaker, The Fierce, Unruly Life of Jessica Mitford. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here and host the program this evening. Now, for those of you that are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and the history of California and the West. Now, the book club publishes limited edition, finely made books. We have a scholarly journal called the Quarterly Newsletter, and we have keepsakes for our members. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, book history, California history, print culture, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest and the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit us online at bccbooks.org to join or donate or just find out more about the Book Club of California. Now, tonight's program is titled Troublemaker, The Fierce, Unruly Life of Jessica Mitford. And our speaker is Carla Kaplan. Now, Carla Kaplan is the Davis Distinguished Professor of American Literature at Northeastern University, where as the founding director of the university's Humanities Center, she created a conversational hub dedicated to diversity. She has held positions at Yale University, the University of Southern California, Wellesley College, and the University of Illinois. And she also teaches writing through arts councils and writers' centers. She is the author, and she's an author and an editor whose books include Miss Anne in Harlem, The White Women of the Black Renaissance, Zora Neale Hurston, A Life in Letters, and The Erotics of Talk, Women's Writing and Feminist Paradigms. Now, Carla Kaplan has received such academic honors as the Robert D. Klein Award, the Mary L. Cornell Distinguished Visiting Professorship at Wellesley College, the Fannie Hurst Professorship at Washington University, and many others. As well as fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the New York Public Library's Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers, the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Culture, the National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Program, the National Humanities Center, the Harry Ransom Center, the Beinecke Library, and elsewhere. Now, tonight, our speaker will talk about her latest book, Troublemaker, The Fierce, Unruly Life of Jessica Mitford. Troublemaker tells the wild and unlikely story of Jessica Mitford, fifth of the six famous Mitford Girls, a British aristocrat-turned-American communist. She is famous for exposés like The American Way of Death. Now, Carla Kaplan's remarkable biography of Jessica Mitford is a journey through the many social and political worlds contained in a single family. And it's a captivating story of a fascinating woman, her sisters, and their lives in the 20th century. Now, among other accolades, the book is a 2026 PEN Literary Award finalist and a finalist for the 2025 National Book Critics Circle Award. So we are going to be giving away 3 copies of Troublemaker, The Fierce, Unruly Life of Jessica Mitford in tonight's webinar. Now, if you're attending the webinar and you're here today, you are already entered into the drawing, and I'll announce the winners at the end of the presentation. Now, if you have any questions for our speaker, you can use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom, and we will have time for a conversation at the end or at the top of the hour. And I'll use the questions and the comments in the chat and the Q&A to curate that conversation. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Carla Kaplan. Carla, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. I want to begin by thanking Kevin Kosick for inviting me and for telling folks in the webinar. I unfortunately cannot see you and I won't be able to monitor the chat because it's hard enough for me to do the PowerPoint and the talk. But if you need me to know something, like maybe the volume isn't loud enough, usually they can hear me in Oklahoma. But if you have any trouble hearing me, just put a comment in the chat to Kevin and he will get right to me. So what I want to do is try to give you a sense of the book and Jessica Mitford and leave a little bit of time for questions. There's Jessica Mitford with her muckrake. Jessica Mitford became famous as a muckraker and a social justice activist, a white woman who could be remarkably effective in working class Black communities and with radical youth. But of course, that was not the life she was raised for. She was born on September 11th, 1917, you can't make that up, into one of the most eccentric and insular families in all of the British aristocracy. Her father, who you see there on the left, David Freeman Mitford, known as Baron Redesdale, had more land than cash, was a hereditary life member of Parliament, and in fact, his title in Parliament was Chancellor of the Drains. And the reason he was Chancellor of the Drains is that Baron Redesdale lived in a kind of terror that women might try to use the parliamentary bathrooms. So his official title in Parliament was Chancellor of the Drains. He was sort of obsessed with plumbing and drains. His insult for everyone was to call them damn sewers. He threw all his daughter's friends out of the house, and he kept a pet mongoose, and he would organize his horses and his hounds on so-called child hunts to hunt down his 6 daughters and his 1 son. The children actually loved it. The villagers were appalled. Now, if anything, the Mitford girls have an even more eccentric mother than father. And you see their mother there as a young woman, Sydney Bowles Mitford, also known as Baroness Redesdale. She was known for her absolute loathing of doctors, the fact that if she was prescribed any pills or medication for herself or for her daughters, she threw them all down the drain. She used to say, the good body will fix itself. The good body will right itself. She detested refrigeration. She used to wail, but it makes the food so cold. She was completely opposed to education for her daughters. She said the company of other children is unnecessary and overstimulating, and all the poor Mitford girls longed for was to be overstimulated, but they were denied any education of any kind. The parents referred to everything outside the family home as elsewhere with a capital E, and they pronounced themselves against elsewhere as if elsewhere were a position. They owned the village they lived in, which meant that they owned the church. They hired and fired the minister. It was their service. They chose the music. And in their church called St. Mary's, they sat in the 2 back pews of the church. And they sat in the very back so that they could watch the congregation without being observed themselves. The family crest, you see it there with the diamonds and the moles. The mole was one of the family symbols. And you see one of the banners for which that the family had as part of their family motto, God careth for us. Now, that's how we would pronounce it, I think. Emphasis on the second word, God careth for us. That is not a proper Mitford family pronunciation. A proper Mitford family pronunciation is God careth for us. They were an incredibly insular family, partly because the parents kept everybody out, and the girls were raised as what the neighbors called a savage little tribe. Decca absolutely adored her sisters. You see her there in the middle, holding, I believe that's a cat, surrounded by her sisters, her one brother, and the parents with a couple of their dogs at least. Decca got her sense of story, wordplay, language, pranks, and teasing from her sisters. They were very much thrown back on one another because they were denied anything else, and they created a world unto themselves. And they stayed as a world unto themselves into their adolescence. This is a famous set of sketches of all of the Mitford girls, as they were always referred to. And you can see from this sketch how extraordinarily beautiful they all were. This is not in chronological order. That's Jessica in the top left corner. All of the Mitford girls, as they were known, chafed at the constraints their parents imposed. They all chafed at the insularity of their family. But no one chafed more than Decca. And there she is at only 4 or 5, looking cross with her arms folded across her chest. She chafed most of all, and for her, the coveted Cotswolds, one of the most beautiful places in the world, was what she called that dread place. Completely cosseted and kept to themselves, all of the Mitford girls, who were not only beautiful, but they were ambitious and driven and brilliant. And so what did they do? They all reached up into absolute thin air to pull down imaginary futures for themselves. The eldest, Nancy, became a novelist. Second oldest, Pamela, became a countrywoman. When her marriage ended, she spent 20 years of her life with an Italian woman who was her lover, and she, unlike the other sisters, kept out of the press. Diana, considered the most beautiful of them all, had the most traditional marriage. She married Brian Guinness, heir to the Guinness fortune. She left him for a man who was not only married, but carrying on an infamous affair with his wife's sister, and who was the founder of the British Fascist Party. His name was Oswald Mosley. Now, if you think that's bad, let me just tell you, it gets worse. Decca's favorite sister was her older sister, Unity, who, when she was 15 years old in the schoolroom, declared that when she grew up, she would be a Nazi. To which Decca, who was not yet 15, and Jessica Mitford was always referred to as Decca, Decca declared, well, then I will be a communist. One of the reasons the Mitford girls became famous is that they all pulled these futures out of thin air and they all realized them. To realize her imagined future as a Nazi, Unity learned German, went to Germany, stalked Hitler at his favorite lunch restaurant. When she was called over to his table, she became his intimate. Youngest sister, Deborah, the youngest of the family, always said she wanted to be a duchess, and she became the Duchess of Devonshire. This is the background from which Jessica Mitford rebelled, but not immediately. It looked for a long time as if Jessica Mitford might fit in. She seemed to fit in as an adolescent. You see her there with her spaniel. You see her as a teenager. And on the far right of my screen, anyway, you see her there getting ready to be presented to the Queen. And it seemed as if she was going to fit in with the family around her. But in fact, her sense of fairness made it impossible for her to ever fit in with the family. And she described her life amongst them as a lonely opposition. This is a picture of the servants' bells in her first childhood home, Astle. The second childhood home was called Swinbrook. And for Decca, this kind of a life where they could summon the servants to them for their beck and call at any moment just never made any sense. For her, the family motto, God careth for us, didn't make sense. She couldn't see why they should be so special. So when she was only 11 years old, Jessica Mitford established what her passbook called a running away account at Drummond's Bank. And every time she got a spare nickel or a dime, she put it into her running away account. Of course, they weren't nickels or dimes. They were British coins, but anytime she got any spare money, she put it into her running away account. She didn't know any runaways, but she had a second cousin who was a famous runaway. His name was Esmond Romilly, and when she was 19, she finally met him, and she ran away with Esmond Romilly, Winston Churchill's nephew, to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Esmond had already been in the Spanish Civil War when Decca met him. He had joined up so early that there wasn't yet an international brigade of British volunteers. There was later. You see a photograph of that British battalion, but he joined up so early there wasn't yet a British brigade. He fought the bloodiest battles of the Spanish Civil War against the fascists on behalf of the Spanish Republicans. And he was one of only 2 survivors of his entire battalion. He barely made it out alive. He had terrible dysentery. He was invalided back to England. After he survived dysentery, it was Esmond's job to travel throughout the British countryside and tell all the families of the fallen how their loved ones had died. Imagine what a job that was. To recover from that, he went to the home of a distant cousin for a country weekend, and there was Jessica Mitford. And they sat together at dinner, and she leaned into him at dinner and said, "Are you going back to Spain?" And he said, "I am." And she said, "Will you take me?" And he said, "I will." And they were in love before dessert. They ran away together using Decca's running away fund. They went throughout Spain, and then they went from Spain to France, and then they went finally to New York. You can see there a wonderful picture of the 2 of them laughing. That's actually in their Greenwich Village apartment in New York. And from New York, they went, strangely enough, to Miami, Florida, because they had the idea that they were going to run a bar. And they had a series of crazy ideas of how they were going to make money, everything from selling silk stockings door to door to trying to run the Roma bar in Miami, Florida. You see Esmond there with his shaker, his cocktail shaker, and Decca there with her little notepad ready to take your order. You can just imagine that none of these things quite panned out, but they did meet a lot of wealthy Americans, including Eugene Meyer, publisher of the Washington Post. And Meyer thought, "Oh, this is too good. We're going to have a series of articles about their madcap adventures." And this is an example of one of those articles. "Blue Blood Adventurers Discover America." It was actually Jessica Mitford's first time of experimenting with journalism all the way back in 1940. They weren't making very much money through any of their get rich quick schemes. And so one of the things they did is they would visit their wealthy friends all over the United States, from the Myers to the Cranes of the great, plumbing fortune. There's plumbing again. Jessica Mitford had the requisite huge black leather handbag that every British person had to have, right? Every British woman had to have a black leather handbag the size of a small suitcase. Well, she had that, and they would go visiting, and she would carry her handbag empty. And then as they visited all their wealthy friends throughout the United States, they would filch any small item they thought they could use to help them make ends meet. One of the jobs Jessica Mitford took early on was selling dresses and modeling dresses. She was happy to use her beauty. Here she's using it to sell and model dresses. What you can't tell in this picture is that she's actually pregnant, and she's girdling a pregnant stomach to still succeed in her dress selling. When war was declared, the madcap time came to an end. Esmond signed up with the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was trained as a navigator or an observer. This was the worst possible job for Esmond, who was constitutionally incapable of paying attention to details, completely absent-minded. The job of a navigator was to pay attention to the most precise details. But he was trained in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and Decca and Esmond were separated. It was very difficult for them both. Neither of them had ever been alone. Decca was with her infant daughter. She was staying with friends of theirs in Washington, D.C., Virginia and Clifford Durr, and they wrote each other daily letters, which fortunately I had access to. Sometimes each of them wrote a letter that was 5 or 6 pages long every day. They couldn't bear being apart, and they talked to each other about everything, including about what had happened when the war was declared between Germany and England, and how concerned Jessica Mitford was about her sister Unity, who you'll remember was Hitler's intimate. On the day that war was declared, Unity went into a park in Germany, took a tiny little pistol out of her large British handbag, put it up to her temple, and pulled the trigger. The bullet went through Unity's brain and it lodged in the back of her skull, and she did not die. She, in fact, lived for about 8 more years, very much incapacitated and brain damaged. Hitler had his company spirit her off to Switzerland, where he visited her, paid for her medical care. They were not able to remove the bullet, however. And Jessica Mitford found out about all this because Unity was constantly in the press. These are the kinds of things they were writing to each other. They were writing about Esmond's training, about Decca's dress selling. She wanted to go to journalism school. She was wondering if that was possible. Here is Esmond as a young man, as a navigator in the middle, in his Royal Canadian Air Force hat. Esmond was unfortunately killed in early December of 1942. His plane was shot down over the North Sea, and no trace of it or him was ever found. Jessica Mitford was in Washington, D.C. with her young daughter, completely alone, cut off from the family, who she called the filthy fascists, and who she blamed for Esmond's death. She had no education, no training, no money, no way of getting money out of England if she had been willing to accept it, and she was not. Somehow she pulled herself up by her own bootstraps, got a job in the Office of Price Administration, which was a New Deal agency devoted to keeping down war profiteering, and started her life as a lifelong anti-fascist. It's a remarkable pivot that I talk about at great length in the book, and try to understand how somebody so alone, so untrained, so devastated, and barely 20 years old could remake her life. In the OPA, she met somebody named Robert Truhaft. Robert Truhaft was a lawyer who was also working in the Office of Price Administration. He was of Hungarian descent, a Jewish progressive lawyer. And the way they saw each other was in the OPA cafeteria. And they loved to tell this story. It's a very telling story about them both. The OPA had a very, here they are. This is to jump ahead. They do get together as a couple. But the way they met was that Bob watched Decca go down the cafeteria line in the OPA cafeteria. And you'll remember large cafeterias have different stations. And she would start in the salad station, and she'd take a plate with salad and eat it as quickly as she could and push the empty plate to the side. Then she'd get to the Jello or fruit salad section and eat that as quickly as she could and push the plate to the side. And then the sandwich section, eat it, push the plate to the side. And then the cake section, eat it, push the plate. Then the coffee section, she'd put a coffee on her tray on top of all the empty plates, get to the cash register, 5 cents. Bob Truhaft watched all of this, and what he said is, oh my, that's the girl for me. He was completely smit. He described her as the most fantastically beautiful woman he'd ever seen, somebody who was both funny and frugal, but he didn't think he had a chance. He told his mother he'd developed a, quote, wild, uncontrollable, and completely futile infatuation for the most terrific female the world had ever seen. Decca ran from him. She wasn't ready for a new relationship. She went to San Francisco. He followed her, fortunately, and they did marry and made a new life in San Francisco. You see the two of them there with her young daughter with Esmond Romilly, and then you see photos of them with her new family. She loved San Francisco. After she married Bob in 1943, she wrote to her family, "I am tremendously happy. All the bitter, horrible past months seem to have vanished." Most importantly, she and Bob Truhaft achieved Decca's lifelong goal, something she had declared herself that she was going to do when she wasn't yet 15. They joined the Communist Party. And she described herself as enchanted by the flesh and blood communists she met. She talked about the alchemy of their conversations, the recognition she got for her organizing work, her journalism, her fundraising. She was promoted within the Communist Party about every 6 months, which recognized her skills. It gave her new structure. It gave her purpose in life. It gave her meaning. And they established themselves in San Francisco and in Oakland, California. They bought a series of homes, first in San Francisco, a 3-bedroom home on Clayton Street, in the heart of Ashbury, and then in Oakland, first on Jean Street, and then in Oakland on Regent Street, between Alcatraz and Woolsey. I can't give you the exact house number, but right near the Berkeley border. And they lived in that house for decades. And much, much later, in 1996, this was where Jessica Mitford would finally die at home in her own living room. And if you look at this final photograph at the bottom, those bay windows are windows onto the living room. Jessica Mitford became famous as a muckraker, famous as a writer, famous as an activist, famous as somebody who could take the most difficult subjects and make them funny. She was also an incredibly successful essayist, and she actually wrote 2 biographies. She did not like the genre of biography. She felt that the job of a biographer was not to talk about the inner life of the subject, not to inquire into the subject's emotions or feelings, but nothing more than to chronicle the subject's doings. So Jessica Mitford's idea of a biography was, on Tuesday, Jessica Mitford ate oatmeal. Then she went to a Communist Party meeting. Then she went to Richmond to protest on behalf of Black homeowners. At night, she had a cocktail. That's not a biography, that's a chronicle. And here, Jessica Mitford and I do disagree. I thought my job was to try to understand a life that went from one extreme to another. The Cotswolds to Oakland, California is a pretty big leap, and I wanted to understand how she lived that leap, why it was she so loved Oakland and San Francisco, and she loved them both. She always said that Oakland was the absolute perfect place for her. I wanted to understand how she survived not only the death of her first love, Esmond Romilly, but they had had an infant daughter who died at only 5 months old. And she and Bob Truhaft had a beloved younger son named Nicholas, who died when he was 11. She lost all of those loved ones, and she also lost her first family of origin, and yet she longed for them all her life. And I wanted to understand how that worked. Why did she continue to long for them, and what did she do with that longing? How did she move from privilege to not only activism, but to incredible professionalism? She was professional as an activist. This is a white mob on the left storming a house that had been purchased by a Black family in Richmond, California. That was their realtor, Neitha Williams. You see her broken window of her realty office. This is Jessica Mitford trying to save the life of Willie McGee, one of the many Black men she tried to free from prison, a man who was wrongly convicted of rape and sentenced to die. She took a white woman's delegation down to Jackson, Mississippi to try to free him. She even knocked on William Faulkner's door. There's a long story about that in the book, which is both horrific and a little bit funny. That's Jessica Mitford in the bottom right corner of her white women's delegation. When Jessica Mitford, like most American communists, understood in 1958 through Khrushchev's revelations what Stalin's atrocities had been and how they had been kept from American communists, she quit the party, as many, in fact, most American progressives did, and she was completely at loose ends. The Communist Party had given her life meaning and structure and purpose, and she had to find a new way of having purpose and meaning in her life, and that is when she became a writer. And she became a writer first with a memoir of the family called Hans and Rebels. It's also called Daughters and Rebels. And her second book was the most famous book she ever wrote, published in 1963, The American Way of Death, which used humor to expose the way funeral industry officials and undertakers were fleecing poor and working class people. The book almost didn't happen. It's very important to Jessica Mitford and Bob Truhaft, who was a co-author of the book, although his name has never appeared on the cover. He was a full co-author, took a year off of his law firm to write the book with her. It's very important to them to be extremely detailed about what undertakers did to bodies. So she went into great detail about embalming and described it in really gruesome detail. Her publisher, Houghton Mifflin, said, "This grisly material has to go. You have to take this chapter out or we are going to pull this book." Jessica Mitford had already spent the advance for American Way of Death. She was a young, not a young person, but a young writer. She was in her early career, and she refused to cave. She refused to have that chapter pulled. Houghton Mifflin did, in fact, cancel the contract. If you want to find out how it was that the book went on to be published and became such an extraordinary bestseller, it outsold everything on the New York Times bestseller list by a factor of 4. This included Betty Friedan, James Baldwin, Rachel Carson. She was the most renowned, celebrated nonfiction writer of her day. And to understand how she got from Houghton Mifflin saying, "We're canceling your contract," to that, you'll have to read the book. But it was remarkably brave for an early career writer to refuse to cave. And it led to a career of incredible bravery, both as an activist, you see her there in one of her mugshots, and as a writer. She knew everybody, traveled in every circle. I hope you can see the photograph in the top corner and that my picture isn't obscuring it. If it is, move my picture out of the way so that you can see that Jessica Mitford in her polka dot dress is standing with Woody Allen. And in the bottom there she is in front of her beloved microphone. She loved giving lectures and speeches, and after American Way of Death, she was in constant demand. She was as much in demand as a speaker as she was as a writer. It also led to many lifelong great friendships with other writers. You see her there with a writer I think you'll recognize. That was Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou was one of many writers in the Bay Area who became dear friends. They included Susan Griffin and the great writer Dorothy Bryant. I think Dorothy Bryant's daughter, Lori Ungaretti, is here with us tonight. And Jessica Mitford had an incredibly full and rich life as an activist, a writer, and a speaker. And she kept her sense of fun, the sense of fun she had gotten from her sisters, her sense of play all her life. You see her here in 1994, 2 years before her death. Jessica Mitford loved to sing. She would warble out English ballads at the top of her voice. 2 years before she died, she started a band called Decca and the Decktones. It was a mostly kazoo band with some drums and other accompaniment. She bought herself a spangly dress. You see her there in her one spangly dress. And she would perform, including at New York's Town Hall, warbling out Spanish ballads. She always kept her sense of fun and her sense of play. there she is in her funny feathered glasses and tiara. And all her life, she also tried to hold on to the family, which I think broke her heart. You see her here on the family island of Inchkenneth. They owned an island in the Inner Hebrides of Scotland. She's sitting on a hillside in the color snapshot with her mother. That's the family house on Inchkenneth. At one point, when Jessica Mitford bought out all her sisters and owned Inchkenneth by herself, she tried to give Inchkenneth to the Communist Party so that they could use it as a resort. And the Communist Party had to say to her, well, Jessica, thank you, but we don't really do that. So giving it to the Communist Party didn't quite work. But she was always trying to bridge her worlds. Her world as a British aristocrat and her world as an activist, a communist, a muckraker, an anti-fascist, an anti-authoritarian, and a progressive. And it's part of what makes her so fascinating is the way she tried to bring her worlds together. It didn't always work. I don't think her family ever recognized her or ever truly could see her. Once she finally got her passport back, and in the 1950s, like all American communists, Jessica Mitford was denied a passport. When she finally got it back, she made her way back to England and to France every year to visit her family. She never stopped trying to be connected to them, and they never really met her efforts in a full or a heartfelt way. I talk about that a lot in the book, and I think a lot about what that cost her. I do think she had the last laugh. There's Jessica Mitford winking. She lived what I consider to be a completely fulfilling life, one that she lived both in defiance and in brilliant use of the accident of birth and of the inevitability of death. And we can leave that photograph up as we prepare to take questions. And I'll stop right there.
I'm back. That was love this photo that you left up for the end. It's great. We'll keep it up for a minute, as you said, and then we'll take it down and we'll just have our faces up so people can see you a little better. But we
Great.
can't take away this wonderful photo of this incredibly interesting woman. Like, who wouldn't want to know her? She's so crazy and interesting. So thank you for sharing this fascinating individual. This was fun. I have so many questions about her and her family and her life, but part of me doesn't want to ask them all because I don't want you to give away the book. I did put in the chat how people can buy the book. We are going to give away 3 copies in a few minutes, but we're going to give you a chance to put some of your questions up there in the chat.
And I have to say the really wild stories, Kevin, that I couldn't tell about the family and their sort of lunatic doings about Jessica and Esmond when they ran away, about the fact that the family sent a British destroyer to try to get them back, about her life as an aristocratic communist. I mean, all of these are detailed at great, detail in the book, but I couldn't get them in tonight.
Yeah, and you don't want to get them all in because then, why get the book? Although
Right.
it's a pretty big book, and there's lots of great stories in there. There's no way we can talk about all of them. But I think the first thing before I source some of these questions from the chat that I want to ask is, what originally got you hooked on on Jessica Mitford, the Mitford Girls, and telling this story and kind of understanding the whole push and pull of her life between the aristocracy and her progressive views and everything she did. What got you initially hooked on that?
What got me hooked on her and what made working on her life and on this book such a gift, there were really 2 things. And the second one, I didn't know until fairly recently how desperately I would need it. But the first one was the way she was constantly able to pivot and to refashion her life to find fulfillment. Here was somebody born into a life that most people would kill for. People are very sort of jealous of this aristocratic, privileged, wealthy life in the Cotswolds. Decca didn't want any part of it. She wanted a different kind of a life. She started to make that with Esmond. Then she had his tragic death. Then she had to pivot again. Her life was a series of self-transformations and extraordinary pivots. And many of us like to fantasize about what it would take to have the life we think we really want, to
Mm,
transform ourselves, to have a completely chosen life. Very few of us have either the resources or the courage to throw everything away, start our lives over from scratch, and have completely chosen lives. And the thing that fascinated me about Jessica Mitford was the way she survived tragedies and setbacks, but also how completely chosen her life was. It was not a choice that everybody would make. It was
mm.
certainly not a choice her sisters would have made. Her sisters were not giving up the aristocracy for a life in Oakland, California as an American communist. But that was Jessica Mitford's choice. It wasn't just something that happened to her. That was the life she wanted. And that was fascinating to me. The ability to
Mhm.
tell, I wanted to tell this story of a really chosen life. And then, as I got to know Jessica Mitford over the years that I worked on this book, she gave me something it turned out I really needed, which was a model for how to both resist authoritarianism, fascism, tyranny, bullies, and how to keep up your spirits and the spirits of other people. Jessica Mitford's gift was always fighting back. She was
Mhm.
constitutionally incapable of bending the knee. She never bent the knee to anybody, starting with her own parents and ending with the House Un-American Activities Committee. Didn't matter who you were, Jessica Mitford was not going to bend the knee to you. She wouldn't tolerate any form of personal or political bullying. She took her enemies very seriously. She also laughed at them, and she trained everybody around her to laugh at them. It's one of the reasons we need her so desperately today. She would be having a field day with the current administration. She would take it very seriously. Jessica Mitford wouldn't stand for these recent New York Times subpoenas, for example, right? Her op-ed would have appeared 6 hours later. She could be a very fast writer when she needed to be. But she would have also been getting us all to laugh at them. And that's a very potent political weapon. The ability
Mhm.
to take your opponent down with laughter was her great gift. And I don't know if any of the people on this webinar, like me, just sort of want to pull the covers over your head some days. If you wake up thinking, I can't look at the news, I can't bear it, I can't take it. Jessica Mitford lived through worse than we've experienced. She lived through World War II. She lived through fascism. She lived through the Red Scare. She lived through HUAC. She
Ah,
lived through
yeah.
some of the bloodiest battles of the 20th century of American racism, which she was doing her best to fight as a white person. And yet she always got up every day ready to have a good time, meet with friends, have a drink, have a laugh. And that's an important model, I think, for today when
Mhm.
things seem so grim.
Yeah, I was surprised by how many of the photos you shared that she's smiling and laughing in, because I
Yeah.
didn't think of her as somebody with a sense of humor, right, or who was, looking at things that way, because she had such strong convictions, right, and so
And
tenacious in
and
every other
and
part of
her
her
sense of
life.
humor was every bit as strong as her political convictions. And it was the key to her political success because everybody wanted to be in the room with Jessica Mitford. There's a myth out there, Kevin, a stereotype that women activists are grim and gray and cheerless. Nobody wants to be around them. They're over earnest. They're right. And Jessica Mitford really gives the lie to that stereotype. She
Hmm.
was the person everybody wanted to be around because she was hysterically funny and genuinely interested in other people. And it was part of her success as an activist and as a writer.
So there's a great question in the chat that kind of dovetails into one of my questions, because I think you said early on that um, Decca and the sisters didn't really have a formal education, right? Is that
Nothing, zero,
nothing?
nothing.
So did they have books in the house? Like what was, books are such a window to the world. So what was their lives like if they didn't have schooling? And then the fact that she went on to write multiple books without a formal education early on is just so fascinating. Can you
And
tell us a
and
little bit
her
about?
sister, yeah, and her sister
Yeah,
Nancy was, of course, a famous novelist, Love in a Cold
yeah.
Climate, The Pursuit of Love, also a biographer, great writer. Um, they they had no education of any kind. Only one of the sisters ever went to school, and only for 1 year. They were all denied education. Decca was desperate for an education. She actually thought she wanted
Ah,
to be a scientist, and she begged to go
mm,
to school, and her parents would never let her go to school. She never got over her resentment of that. When she was asked about it, even very, very late into her life, she would always cry. It brought her to tears that she was denied an education. They had a series of governesses who were not supervised by the parents and who mostly just left the children to their own devices. The governess they remembered most fondly was the governess who used to take all the girls to town to teach them a bit of jiggery pokery, which was shoplifting. And you can see that Jessica later made very good use of that with her black handbag. What they did have was an enormous library. Their
mm,
grandfather on their father's side, Barty Mitford, was a famous writer. He was actually he had been an ambassador to Japan. He wrote a series of books. They are partly anti-Semitic screeds, and he was famously anti-Semitic, as was her grandfather on her mother's side. But he had one of the great private libraries, and the family inherited that library, and they kept it intact. And they put the library in a barn that was adjacent to the house and built a walkway from the barn to the house. And the
mm,
children, who were very much unsupervised, were allowed to peruse it at will. And all of them were autodidacts. They all trained themselves. They were very curious,
mm,
very smart, very driven, very interested in learning. And it's part of what made Jessica Mitford an absolutely terrific investigative journalist and researcher, because she grew up training herself. And all she knew as a researcher was to follow her own curiosity. And nothing ever stopped her curiosity. As a child,
mm.
as a young woman, she was allowed to just read where her interests took her. And most of us, of course, have some of that sort of beaten out of us by schooling, by disciplines, by graduate school, by expertise. Well, that was never beaten out of Jessica Mitford. So she was always somebody who followed her curiosities. And it's part of why her writing is so incredibly entertaining and engaging, because it's the writing of somebody who just goes down whatever rabbit hole most interests her.
So yeah, so interesting. Uh, how she got. So tell us about a little bit about the sisters. And they were estranged, but she was. I mean, was she close to any of them throughout this time period, or were they in communication with each other? And especially Nancy, the oldest, right, who's the
Um,
novelist.
she stayed fairly close to Nancy. Nancy was quite a bit older and a difficult person, but
Mm,
she stayed fairly close to Nancy, who died somewhat young of a horrific cancer. Decca was there. In fact, all the sisters were there for that. She never had anything to do with Diana after she ran away. So Diana, in fact, who was with Oswald Mosley when England and Germany declared war, spent part of the World War II in Holloway Prison as a traitor to the British Empire, because of her support of fascism once England and Germany were already at war. Diana went to her grave completely unrepentant for her lifelong fascism. Diana actually went to her grave insisting that the Holocaust was the fault of the Jews. There are YouTube
Mm.
videos that people can find of Diana towards the very end of her life, insisting on this, refusing to apologize for her fascism. And she and Decca had no relationship at all. Decca very much blamed her family's fascism, not just for Esmond's death, but for all of the people who suffered under fascism. She really couldn't forgive the family, their right-wing attitudes, their support of right-wing causes. And yet, even after Unity's long relationship with Hitler, Decca never completely cut Unity off. After Unity shot herself in the head and lived for years, Decca would write her, Decca would send her love. The sister to whom she was probably closest in her life was her youngest sister, Deborah, the Duchess of Devonshire. And they tried very hard to maintain a relationship. But if you were to create two opposite lifestyles, Decca's left-wing, middle-class Oakland life and Debo's life as the Duchess of Devonshire and the chatelaine of Chatsworth House and Chatsworth Estate, it's hard to create lives more opposite. And yet they
Hmm.
tried. Debo visited Decca in Oakland. Decca said, "You're going to have to sleep on the living room couch." And fortunately, Decca's daughter, Dinky, Constancia, knew that she should make her aunt a reservation at the finest hotel in Berkeley, you know. So they tried very hard to maintain a relationship. It was difficult. Debo never really understood Decca's choices. And I spend a lot of time talking about how sympathetic Decca was to their choices and how unsympathetic they were to hers. But Decca also insisted on staying connected to them. The last conversation Decca ever had just before she passed away was a phone call with her sister in England.
Interesting. We're getting towards the top of the hour, but I do want to have you talk a little bit about um, her kind of membership in the Communist Party and how that, I mean, she had her passport revoked. Well, like what else did she have to suffer? What other obstacles were, and Bob too, right? Because was he also a member of the Communist
He
Party?
was he was a member of the Communist Party, and I was lucky enough in a random folder of his archive in New York City to actually stumble on his Communist Party membership card. I was so
Oh,
thrilled
wow.
to actually hold his membership card in my hand. When you became a member of the Communist Party, and they both joined in the 1940s, and they were thrilled to join in part because they really wanted to fight American racism. And as they said, in the 1940s, if you cared at all about something like racism, there was only one game in town, and it was the American Communist Party.
Communist Party.
And Decca spent 20 years as an activist with the Communist Party's Civil Rights Congress, where she was able to fight racism and learn what it meant to be, I think, what Ibram Kendi calls how to be an anti-racist. Well, Decca was getting those lessons for 20 years in the Civil Rights Congress. Bob Truehalf's membership card, when you joined the Communist Party in the 1940s, you didn't join under your own name. You created a pseudonym. So
Mm.
Robert Truehaft, RT, his membership card is in the name of Rufus Timebolt, RT. So it was great to sort of hold that in hand. It gave them not only a way to fight for the causes they cared about, originally to fight fascism, global fascism, not just a worry about American fascism, but global fascism, racism, economic injustice. It gave them an entire structure. Jessica Mitford's work with the Civil Rights Congress was the first place where she learned to be a working person. When you grow up in the British aristocracy, you're not trained to be a working person. In fact,
Yeah.
you're very much trained not to be a working person. And she learned how to work in the Civil Rights Congress of the Communist Party. And very importantly, her skills as a worker were recognized by the party. And every 6 months or so, she was promoted because she was an incredibly skilled organizer, investigator, a
Hmm.
brilliant, brilliant fundraiser whose parties in Oakland were absolutely famous. She would have these hysterical fundraising parties where you paid to get in, then you paid to use the bathroom, then you paid to have a drink, but you had to pay if you didn't want to drink, and if you wanted to leave, you had to pay to get out. She was always coming up with a new scheme, and she was extremely effective. And she learned to be a journalist and to be an investigator in part in the party. And it was something she and Bob shared. And they shared completely political ideals of economic and racial justice. And it gave her life 20 years of structure and meaning. It was really quite a devastating blow for her to lose that in 1958.
Yeah. I'm just pulling up the list of all the attendees so I can draw our winners of our drawing. Um, so if you're still with us, which I hope you are, I pulled all of the attendees who are here at this webinar, and I did a random search selection, random number generator to determine who the winners of the 3 copies of the book are. And I'm so excited about this book and this talk that we're actually going to draw 4. I just couldn't do
Oh,
3. So I drew a 4th name just because I like more people should get this book. So I drew the names and I'm going to put them in the chat now. But the 4 winners of the drawing are Andrew Gerson, Barbara Voltmer, Mark Sherman, and Irina Ranahan. I know some of I think I know all of those names. And many of those folks have been to other presentations here at the book club. So I'm going to be contacting those 4 winners. Congratulations to the winners of our drawings. I'll be contacting you to send you your copy of the book or arrange for you to pick it up here at the book club. Mark Sherman just typed in, I won. I won.
and
But for those of
can
you
I
who
just
didn't win, go ahead, Carla.
I was just going to say, Kevin, if anybody, normally at a live event, I'd sign books. You would be able to buy books, which you can get on Amazon or through Harper or bookshop.org. Obviously, I can't do that, but if anybody wants a signed book, I can get book plates and send them. Just contact me through email, and I'll be happy to do that.
And I put back up in the chat a second time your website so people can get a hold of you on your website,
Great.
but also the other ways you can buy a copy of the book. If you weren't one of our big winners tonight, we do want you to still maybe buy a book if you're interested in learning more about Jessica Mitford. So we're past the top of the hour now, perfect timing, and I'm going to sign off by first thanking you, Carla, for doing this talk for the Book Club of California. This was amazing. I know we left the picture of Jessica Mitford up there the whole time. I just
We did.
can't can't stop looking at it. I love that she's got a cigarette in her hand too.
Isn't that great? I
It's
know, it's
such a
so
great
1990s, right? It's late 80s, early 90s. There she is with
yeah.
her cigarette. Lifelong
It
drinker and smoker. And when she decided to quit both, I mean, she was a very serious drinker, by the way. She started every day at 6 a.m. with a mug full
oh
of vodka. She just quit both cold turkey. No programs, no pills, no aids, no nothing. That's how willful she was. When she quit, she
yeah.
just quit.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me that she did
Yep.
it that way. Yeah. So love that picture. I'm glad we kept it up the whole time. Thank you again for doing this presentation for us. I am going to send you the chat and the Q&A because there are a couple of
Excellent.
comments and questions in there that we didn't get to because they probably require maybe a longer answer than we had time for tonight. But I'm going to send that to you. And if there's folks you want to get back to, you can because you'll have the contact information, or you can get back to me and I can get back to folks on your behalf. So I will be sending you all of those wonderful things. And
Great.
again, a huge thank you for doing this for us. And a huge thank you for everyone out there for attending this Book Club of California program. You can register for all of our programs online at bccbooks.org/programs or in the emails that you're probably getting from the book club announcing all of the upcoming programs. So please join us for a future program here on Zoom or in our club rooms here in San Francisco or at Pasadena Heritage in Southern California once a month. please check us out and come back for another program. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks again, Carla. I'll be following up with you soon. This was terrific. I really appreciate this. One of my favorite programs we've had. Thank you so much.